Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the first episode of Pam and Henry. My name is
Hello.
Henry.
Hi, this is Pam.
Hi Pam, how are you?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing good. So, we are doing this show for the first time.
Yeah,
Pam, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
sure. I'm born to a Chinese parent in communist China, and I came here as a student, and I became a naturalized U.S. Citizen. So I look Chinese and speak Chinese sometimes, but I'm full-blooded American.
Great.
How
And my
about
name
you?
is and my name is Henry. I immigrated to the United States with my parents when I was a teenager. I experienced high school as an immigrant
Hmm.
and so I've been in the United States for over 40 years.
Hmm.
The reason I'm interested in doing this show is I want to share a little bit about my experience growing up in the United States as an immigrant and how my thinking, my identity, um, thinking about am I Chinese or am I American, how that
Hmm.
has shifted over the years.
Wow. That sounds great. I think as new immigrant, we all have our experience of being in America, and I think it's a great topic, and I think a lot of people can relate to our personal story. Mm.
Right. So, one thing I like to explore is this comment that I've heard.
Mhm.
So I've been in the United States for 40, almost 40 years now.
Mhm.
And I hear this comment repeated in Chinese media and also even in conversation with friends. A lot of people will often say, no matter how American you act, you will never be fully accepted as an American.
Mhm.
And because as ethnic minorities, certainly Asians, we always will look like foreigners, I guess, to the quote unquote regular Americans.
Mhm.
So, have you heard these kind of comments, and what does that say to you when somebody says something like that?
It's an interesting question. I've heard that before, but I haven't been told by anybody around me. Nobody made this comment to me personally, but I have heard that before. I've been in this country for about 20 years. And so I came here in my 20s. I came here as a student. I think in the first few years, I did feel like I'm a foreigner because I was studying in a school in Midwest, and it's not on the West Coast or East Coast, and there are not many like Asian people, Asian population back then, and I feel like a lot of people haven't who were born and grew up in this country, they haven't traveled extensively outside of US. They haven't been part of the Asian society or country. So sometimes people look at me, it's like I came from a very different world. But I think that I consider it my responsibility to assimilate myself to this society because I chose to be here. I chose to come to America. I chose to pursue my American dream here. And I think that responsibility lies on me. So, so with that attitude, I feel like, it is an American dream that I need to realize on my own. So yeah, I've heard that before, but it didn't affect me and my process of assimilating myself to this society. What about you? Because you came here as a high school student, right? Much
Right,
younger. Yeah.
right. And I really admire that about you because I think you came to that realization much sooner than I did, even though I've been in the United States for a very long time. And I think back to when I was in high school. I think high school was a very difficult time
Yeah.
for somebody to come
Mm-hmm.
here as an immigrant because I didn't speak English all that fluently. So coming to high school in America was a huge cultural shock for me.
Mm-hmm.
I did not feel comfortable expressing myself because I felt that I lacked the language skills. And also I went to high school in Atlanta, Georgia, back in the 1980s. That was Atlanta wasn't quite the deep South as the rest of the South, but it was
Mm-hmm.
different enough from maybe California or New York, the coasts,
Mm-hmm.
that I really stuck out as as somebody who just didn't quite fit in.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, I think I I I wouldn't say I experienced overt racism, but I certainly felt a sense of alienation, and I think that sense of alienation really formed how I interacted with the society. And as a result, I when I went to college, I when I went to college in UC Berkeley, it was to me it was a huge transformation because I went from a school where I was one of very few Asians to a
Mm-hmm.
campus where 40% of the campus
Yeah.
was Asian.
Yeah.
And I felt that sense of strength in numbers. Whereas back in high school, if somebody made a kind of a, I wouldn't call it racist crack necessarily, but certainly a lot of the white kids that I went to school with, they had no experience dealing with Asians, and all they knew were the stereotypes. And
Yeah.
they didn't necessarily mean to be racist about it, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's what they knew.
Yeah.
Everywhere I went,
Mm-hmm.
people were asked, "Hey, you Bruce Lee? You know Kung Fu?"
That's
And
great. I enjoy that stereotype.
and and I think really back in high school, uh, I can count on my one hand the kind of stereotypes that we encounter as Asians.
Mm-hmm.
Um, either Bruce Lee, do you know Kung Fu,
Mm-hmm.
or there was the old movie from the 30s, the Fu Manchu character,
Mm-hmm.
the arch villain,
Mm-hmm.
um, or maybe uh, some people will make a crack at, hey, houseboy, because the early Chinese Americans that came to the U.S., they were coolies and they were servants.
Oh.
So those were the kind of
Mm-hmm.
stereotypes that we had to contend with.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when I'm the only Asian in the crowd, people make remarks like that.
Mm-hmm.
I just felt like, what can I do? I just have to take it.
I
But when I
see.
went to Berkeley,
Yeah. It's
suddenly
different.
things just changed
Yeah.
because 40% of the campus weren't necessarily Chinese, but
Yeah.
they were Asians, and
Yeah.
there were a lot of Asian student groups
Yeah.
where we were very active on campus.
Yeah.
So I really got involved in the student
Mm-hmm.
activities, and we felt that there was that sense of um, solidarity, right?
Yeah.
Uh, the Chinese students, the Asian students, the Japanese students, the Koreans,
Mm-hmm.
Indian Americans, the Filipinos,
Mm-hmm.
all of the student groups to come together. So we really embrace that um, the ideology, I guess. Berkeley
Mm-hmm.
being a famous leftist
Mm-hmm.
campus, so I really
Mm-hmm.
thrived in that environment,
Yeah, I
thinking
can
that
tell.
I'm no longer, this minority that had to take the abuse. whether it's
Mhm.
intentional or unintentional. And that really formed my worldview for, I
Mhm.
would say, a very long time. I I voted Democrat
Mhm.
my entire life until
Mhm.
actually
Mhm.
quite recently,
Mhm.
until 2016 to be exact.
Mhm.
Then I really came to a huge awakening. I really had to reevaluate whether
Mhm.
the things that I used to think was the case. I really had to question everything, and I thought that was and
Mhm.
that actually that forms part of the reason that I want to talk about this
Mhm.
in a show like this.
Wow, that's fascinating. And because I remember I read some statistics about, like, the majority of the Asian Americans, there are Democrats. And I think it was not until the 2020, this time, I think the Asian Americans, like, they about 30% of them voted Republican, but in the past it's like over 60 or 70% of them are Democrats. And I think a lot of people, they may be able to relay your personal story greatly. And I think that even though I'm also the first generation new immigrant and I came here in my 20s, but the country I came from is very different from yours. I know, Henry, you're from a free democratic society, Taiwan, which
Right,
I admire so much. And my forefathers were not lucky enough to escape the communists. So we were the mainlanders. So, and
right,
I personally, when I was a second year student, I witnessed the Tiananmen massacre. And I remember in my university, which is a top university in China, like 90% of the students, they were taking GRE or TOEFL. Everybody wants to escape. And I also remember when we were in Tiananmen Square, when we met the journalist from Voice of America, from BBC, from the international Western media, they're like our best friends. And so that is my, affinity with the Western society, because it has always represented the value of freedom and democracy. And so when I first came here, I feel this is my country. And probably, we're different because, I was a girl and you're a boy. And probably I think people are more, they probably will not call me Bruce Lee. They probably think, it's a Chinese girl. I hear that all the time. They think it was interesting. So I probably experienced less discrimination or alienation than the boys had. And but I feel like when people, they feel like I'm foreign, or or different, I will tell them, hey, what, you remember the one man behind, standing in front of the tank? I was there.
right.
Bam, I was a hero. So I think I think that, I just feel like I want to tell my story so people can better understand where I came from. So even though I spoke and I still speak with a Chinese accent, but I want to tell people that my American story is just as great as everybody else, as your great great grandfather, and people who first came to this country. My immigrant story was just as great as yours. So I was, coming from the communist China, it gives me that affinity to this country. I feel that this was my country and this is my country. Yeah.
That's great. And I think I certainly in the future I'd like to explore a lot more of that perspective, and let's see how we can share that experience as we witness what's taking place in American society right now, right?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And also, I want to take every opportunity to educate them what is the true Chinese culture, because a lot of people think Chinatown, chopstick, chao siu,
Right,
or fireworks, that's Chinese culture. I tell no, no, our food is way better, delicious than what you have experienced. So follow me, and I'm going to take you to authentic Chinese restaurant, to dim sum, and to Peking duck and Sichuan. And so I try to bring my diversity as a new experience for people who are the regular Americans. I want to enrich their experience, enrich their mind, and broaden their view. I feel this is my contribution to this country as a new immigrant. I want to be part of the vibrant fabrics of this melting pot.
right. So to get back to my original stream of consciousness, I
Yeah.
guess.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I was getting back to how my thinking transformed. So I think in college, I I felt that I unconsciously fell victim to what we call identity politics,
Mm-hmm.
because we identify ourselves by our race, by our ethnicity, and we felt that we need to have this solidarity. And so I quickly I aligned myself. Um, I started to see the world through the lens of race, in a sense. And I remember a really good friend of mine who came from Taiwan. He immigrated much later than I did, and when he came, I told him that if you're an immigrant, you have to be a Democrat. There's just no way you can be anything else. And many years later, he threw this back in my face when I told him that I eventually became a Republican.
Oh, I want to know your story. I want to know what transformed you.
um, I think it is, and this is the story I was not finding a very direct way of trying to tell the story. I
Okay.
think I was when I see the world through the lens of race, then everything is tinted, by that color.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was an intentional reinforcement of that um, on the left, whether you call that liberal or that progressive side of the body politic. And I fully subscribe to that. But by doing that, I felt that I actually held myself apart from American society. For the longest time, I actually did not feel American because I actually bought into that statement that I brought up, that no matter how American you act, well, they, quote unquote, they will never see you as American. Of course, there is we see this a lot, right? Um, no matter where we go, you will have people who say, "Oh, where are you from?" They
Yeah.
just assume you're not from America.
Yeah.
And of course, they will always say, "Oh, you speak English so well." And
You wouldn't say that to a regular American, right?
right. So certainly, um, and I know that some people take offense to that. And I even used to take some offense to that. Not necessarily take offense, but I felt that that was a constant reminder that we're not quite
Mm.
fully American, right? But over the years, I gradually came to the realization that um, but what is American? American is not what other people think. It is how you think. After all, this is the land of opportunity. America is the land of immigrants. So if I embrace the American value, I embrace the spirit of independence and the opportunity, and also um, the pursuit of happiness and liberty and justice that's embodied in the American Constitution, that makes me American. I would say right now, as a naturalized citizen, um, I possess all of the rights as any other American citizen. So who is to say that I am not American, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So so the only thing that really is um, holding me apart is myself. It's really nobody else. And but I did not really come to that realization until, you know, I would say fairly late in life, I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there is also in the immigrant community, there is a notion that you should not forget your roots, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think there are some of our fellow Chinese American immigrants who will say, well, if you think you're an American, does that mean that you no longer consider yourself Chinese?
Yeah, they're not mutually exclusively.
Right,
You don't have to be mutually exclusive.
right. So
Mm.
I think, as a matter of fact, I think as immigrants, that actually is what we can contribute to the
Mm.
society, is that cultural background, that perspective that we can
Mm.
bring to this melting pot.
Yeah.
And I came to the realization that, you know, we hear that America is this cultural melting pot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for America to succeed, it needs to be a melting pot.
Mm-hmm.
There is this diversity in our society. But if we hold so fast to this diversity that
Mm-hmm.
we refuse to melt with each other, then we have this very balkanized society
Yeah.
that doesn't melt together. And I think this is where division and suspicion creeps in, right? So so over time, I came to this realization that I really need to
Mm.
assimilate. And even assimilation, this word,
Yeah.
was even a bad word
Yeah. I
when
know.
I consider myself
Yeah.
a progressive,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, can you tell me, like, you talk about the realization. Was it a sudden realization, or something happened, and it was that defining moment that made you realize?
I really don't have a defining moment, I must say. Um, the only thing that I can put my finger on is I started to pay a lot of attention to the human rights situation in
Mm-hmm.
China
Yeah.
right around maybe a decade ago. I really started to pay a lot of attention to uh, what's going on in China in terms of the human rights abuses,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm trying to find out how come we're not getting any coverage in the Western media, and how come
Mm.
the politicians are simply not prioritizing the human rights abuses in China. So even though I started listening to National Public Radio right after I graduated from college because I felt that, well, now I have a real job, I'm a grown up,
Mhm.
I need to be more informed on current events. So I thought, wow, National Public Radio, that sounds really official. That must be a good source of news. So I started listening to NPR
Mhm.
every day on my commute, going to work, coming home. And I was a very loyal NPR listener for over 20 years. And I always I thought it was really a good source for information for public events. Um, of course, I knew that it always leaned left,
Mhm.
but I felt that I could calibrate for that. I knew that they lean left, and when they make those very um, leftist um, coverage, I could tell the difference. So and plus, I was a Democrat. I thought that they were speaking my language anyways. I really didn't have any problem. But it really was until really it was the 2016 because I knew how bad Hillary Clinton's human rights records were with regard to what was going on in China. And I felt that she really was going to sell out um, the Chinese people. I thought she was a really bad candidate.
Mhm.
But I really didn't know anything about Donald Trump. I felt that Trump was a loudmouth. He was not
Yeah. Mhm.
he simply was not a very palatable political candidate. I was really stuck. I felt that we simply didn't have a good candidate that year. But I decided to vote for Trump anyways because I'd rather vote for a candidate that I didn't know how bad was as opposed to vote for a candidate I knew was totally bad. Um, but I just thought that it was simply a throwaway protest vote because I didn't think Trump was going to win that year. There's no way he was going to win because all of the polls, all of the news were predicting Clinton had a what 97%,
Yeah.
99% chance of winning that year, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
So I voted and I went to sleep. I didn't bother to watch uh, the election coverage. And I
Mhm.
woke up the next morning and I found out Trump had won. I thought, how
Wow.
about that? I had no expectation, but I thought, well, I'm glad that Clinton's now the
Mhm.
president. But then I started to, I thought, well, I really didn't know much about Trump, but now he's the president. I like to see that he succeed as a president and lead the country in a positive direction. But then I start to follow the tone of the coverage in the news,
Mhm.
and it's just so negative and so and I knew that a lot of the coverage simply was not corresponding to a lot of the facts that I
Mhm.
knew. And to me, that was a wake up moment that I simply can no longer trust the news source that I've come to rely on for the 20 plus years of my adult life. That
Wow.
I had to dig for other news sources. And the funny thing about that was um, I went and started a try to dig up a lot more source material. If they're talking about some policy, I try to read the actual policy document, the actual legislation to understand what
Mhm.
those laws are about, as opposed to
Mhm.
hearing what the reporters are telling me what the laws are about. And at the same time, I decided that maybe I should see what Fox News or
Mhm.
Breitbart News is reporting. Because
Mhm.
prior to that, I thought they were the devil because I was told by NPR that Breitbart was racist. It
Yeah.
was,
Yeah.
this alt right, right? It was there
Mm.
were a bunch of Nazis.
Yeah.
But to my surprise, I when I got over, um, when I actually read this news, I thought, you know, they're not no, they were actually had a much more fair and balanced coverage of events
Mhm.
than what I was seeing from the traditional outlets like the NPR, like
Mhm.
CNN, like New York Times.
Mhm.
And to me, that was a realization that I thought, wow, I really have to just rethink my worldview and start from scratch. I really had to recalibrate a
Mhm.
lot of my understanding of the world and how I've seen this world over the
Mhm.
last 20 years. That was a huge wake up call for me.
So 2016 is a wake up
Yes.
call.
Yeah. Yes.
Wow. I mean, your story really reminded me of the walk away I saw on the YouTube. Many people
Yes.
talk about it, and
Yes.
especially those in California. And people talk about walk away, and also in my local community, I heard people talk about that. It,
I
it is.
believe, I think Brandon Straka, when I read about Walkaway, I think it was maybe in 2017 that he launched that movement.
Mhm.
And I remember seeing, the hashtag walk away, and I thought, wow, so I'm not alone.
Mhm.
That
Mhm.
there are a lot of people doing exactly the same thing that I had done already.
Mhm.
And so that was, but I think it's kudos to Brandon Straka that,
Mhm.
he's really good at, creating a movement like that.
Mhm.
I think that's amazing branding that he did, that he created this
Yeah.
such a good movement.
So I'm just so curious. Can you tell us how your change
Hmm.
um, was received by your friends who used to think as a Democrat, or your former friends from the same school of thought?
Former friends. That's a very operative key term here. Um, I think the problem is the friends that I'm able to come face to face and talk and share these experiences. I think it's easy to talk things out, but
Mhm.
I feel that social media actually has a really negative impact in our ability to communicate with each other
Mhm.
because um, I think I did put a post about my experience on Facebook. Um, I don't know how many of my friends on Facebook actually saw that post, but my background, all of my friends were exclusively Democrat, pretty liberal, pretty progressive.
Mhm.
So most of them were still in the mindset. And I think the problem is that, um, we're so used to listening, or, we are fed this diet of news, of information from the established media. And we have given them credibility. We believe that these are trustworthy news sources. So we no longer question them anymore. So what I try to do on social media is I started to try to poke holes in the news items, in the narrative. And I have to say, it was not well received by my
Mhm.
friends. Um, and sometimes my friends, well, I think that the prevalent perception, of course, is that if you're a Trump supporter, A, you're a bigot,
Mhm.
you're not well educated.
Racist, the redneck.
Exactly.
Yeah, Second Amendment.
Right.
Proud
So
Boys.
so a lot of my friends thought, Henry, what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
You've traveled the world. You're fairly well educated. You have a
Berkeley
responsible professional job,
and Berkeley.
Berkeley, right? So why are you a Trump supporter? They simply um, and the people who I can actually engage on a personal basis when I actually speak to on the phone and talk face to face, I think it's easier to get across.
Mhm.
But I find that, but if you want to share these opinions on social media, I just felt that is
Difficult.
impossible because
Mhm.
it's so easy to digress on the topic. I can make a post and my intention is one thing, but the reader can take that and they will react to it however they want, and they can go down
Mhm.
um, a different path that I did not anticipate,
Mhm.
and that we can just end up in some um, minutiae that simply has nothing to do with the point that I'm trying to make. And then we just get into these arguments that just are completely counterproductive. And I think the problem is on social media, it's too easy to engage in an argument. And we get stuck in trying to win the argument. You can win the argument, but that doesn't mean that you can convince anybody
Mhm.
of your viewpoint. And I think that's the problem with social media is that winning an
Mhm.
argument really doesn't do anybody any good. So
Mhm.
gradually, I just decided, well, it really wasn't even worth the effort anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I can understand. So, Henry, I think that uh, I really think that the Democrat people, and especially those working in the media or academia, they're very likable people. Uh, when I first came to this country, I look up to them. You know, they're the Pulitzer Prize winning journalists. They talk about human rights, and they tend to be very well educated, and they have highly professional job. And I think they're very likable. And also, as a person who came from the communist China, I like people who support the human rights and freedom and for the persecuted Chinese people. And so one thing that always confused me is that why they cannot like Trump. I think Trump has been putting very tough on China, and he's probably the toughest on China. The president toughest on China in the last 20 years. And if you count the president from both sides of the aisle, George Bush, Clinton, Obama, I mean, none of them have ever been tough on China, on trade deal, on human rights. So, in your mind, why the pro human rights, um, democratic elite people, why they don't approve Trump's policy, or they just don't like Trump as a person?
Um, well, first of all, I think I know where all of my Democrat friends are coming from. I think the Democratic Party had always stood for equality,
Yeah.
uh, for helping the little people,
Yeah.
um, to show compassion
Mm-hmm.
to the disadvantaged.
Yeah.
Those are admirable
Yeah.
values, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I embrace that.
Me too.
Um, and I think to a very large extent, um, when I was a Democrat, my feeling was that the Republican Party had always been portrayed as the opposite
Yeah.
of all of those values.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the Republican Party had done a very poor job um, to counter that narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think there are so many different ways that we can explore that topic that maybe we can try to unpack that,
Mm-hmm.
at a later date. But getting back to your point, and also, I think with regard to China, I think one thing I think it's worth stressing is when we talk about China, we're talking about the totalitarian regime that
Yes.
rules China, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The PRC government.
Yeah.
And for one thing, if you listen to the policy statements of the Trump administration, I think for the first time ever of any administration, they are very keen in making that distinction. They
Mm-hmm.
are very clear when you listen to Pompeo, when you listen to President Trump, you listen to Vice President Pence, and so forth, that they're saying that they make a distinction between the Chinese people
Mm-hmm.
and the PRC, the CCP government. So when we're talking about being tough on China, they're talking about
Yeah.
being tough on
Communist Party.
the abuses of the Communist Party
Yeah.
and not the Chinese people. And I think,
Mm.
and a lot of the Chinese people, we understand that when you are being tough on this totalitarian regime, that
Mm-hmm.
this is how America can help the Chinese people,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. That's a very important distinction because I have a lot of friends who are still in China, and they were very upset when Trump was referring to China, China. And so I always tell them what he meant is not you, the Chinese people, or China as a country. What he
Right,
meant was what he was referring to is the ruling party. That was the dictatorship. Chinese Communist Party was not elected by the Chinese people. They just
right,
took the power. So I think a lot of Chinese Americans were struggling with this. So it's important to make that distinction. And also about the so-called Chinese virus, the COVID-19.
right.
A lot of the Chinese Americans took big offense of that because they think you are being racist. And so what was going through your mind when you first heard about the term, the Chinese virus?
Um, I think I can certainly see where that reference can be problematic, especially when
Mm-hmm.
the press chooses to weaponize such a term,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, but at the same time, I think Trump is really good at simplifying language and making and giving it a name, a label that will stick. You know, like it or hate it, he
Yeah,
knows, like low energy Jeb, right?
yeah, yeah.
Um, the
Mini
way that
Mike, Mini
Mini
Mike,
Mike,
Sleepy Joe.
exactly. He's so good at that. He's so good at putting label on people and branding people in a way that it's gonna stick.
So memorable. Yeah.
It is very memorable. Um, and I think when he says the Chinese virus, and that's what he's trying to do. He is telling people this is the origin.
Mm-hmm.
He wants people to remember how this virus came to the United States and created such a havoc in
Mm-hmm.
America.
Yeah.
And that is the simplest way, most direct way of getting that message across. I certainly don't have
Mm-hmm.
a problem with that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, um, getting back to then your original question, but why is it that allow the progressives, the liberals, don't embrace this policy?
Mm-hmm.
The way I see it, really, it is because of the dishonesty of our news media.
Yeah.
Because if you believe everything you read in the mainstream news to be the only truth,
Mm-hmm.
then I think it's very easy to be taken by that narrative. And then you will overlook all of the other alternate narratives that are
Mm-hmm.
out there. And unfortunately, that narrative is Trump is an egomaniac, is a narcissist,
Mm-hmm.
is a racist.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't, I think everything that we've read, that I've read at least, um, when you look at the actual policies that Trump has carried out, um, I think he truly has America's best interest at heart,
Mm-hmm.
but you simply don't see that um, when you
Mm-hmm.
look at the day-to-day coverage on the likes of CNN or
Mm-hmm.
NPR or New York Times, right?
Yeah, and I like to comment on that because, Henry, I was born and grew up in communist China. I thought suppression, censorship, and controlling narrative is only unique to a country like communist China. But that's what I'm seeing here every day. Like, I've seen my friends, their Facebook being censored, their posting were taken down, and Twitter accounts suspended just because they express different opinion from the mainstream media. And when people talk about the Hunter Biden computer hard drive, or they talk about the voter fraud issue, I mean, I thought this is a free country that people should have different opinion and should have a platform to talk about the differences, and let's have a healthy debate, civil, healthy debate. I just don't get it. Why there's this suppression, censorship, and controlling of the narrative here. To me, that just scares me. That reminds me of where I came from, communist China, dictatorship.
Right. And to me, what's more depressing is the press, the state approved press in communist China. They don't even have a choice.
Yeah.
They were told what they were allowed to
Mm.
cover, what they can report, what they cannot report. And if they don't report, they don't toe the party line,
Yeah.
they'll lose their job, they'll lose their freedom, they even might lose their lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the American press don't have any of that restriction. So why do they choose to do what the Chinese press does? I find that particularly depressing in this day and age.
That's
And
disturbing, Henry. I think it's disturbing, it's alarming, and I can see why people took huge risks to their personal safety going out to the street to do public rally and protesting. Some people hold the sign saying, give me liberty or give me COVID-19. I think that's what people were scared of. And I was scared too because when I was in communist China, I know that America is a place where I can escape to. But what if this country became another version of the communist China? What can we do? I mean, that's really a question that has been, bothering me these days.
Yeah, I think there's so much that we need to explore on that, right? So
Yeah, I know.
so why don't we hold that thought
Mm.
and we'll expand on that uh, in our next episode.
Yes, I just feel like I have a lot to learn from you because I know that you also spent years working as a publisher of a Chinese language media in America. And I really want to learn more about what was your motivation and what was your experience, and also about this whole 2020. I just, I'm looking forward to our next conversation. It's been very informative, and thank you for sharing your personal story. It's definitely very, very helpful. A lot of, to me and also to a lot of my personal friends. I really enjoyed this conversation with you.
And so do I. And I think I hope that this is a good start for the two of us. And we have so much that we can explore. So let's continue this conversation next time.
Absolutely. And I think to our viewers, this is the purpose of why Henry and I want to do this show. We want to share our personal story, personal perspective, and our personal journey being a new immigrant in this country, how we look at things. And we hope our views, our stories will provide an extra perspective to how you look at these things. We're only here to contribute our ideas, and hopefully that will enrich your experience and your perspective. So thank you for listening to us, and we look forward to having you next time. Thank you, Henry.
All right. Thank you, Pam.
Thank
And
you.
until next time, thank you,
Yeah,
everybody.
thank
Okay.
you.